Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's nice to be back in Gothenburg. And I understand that there are two big things happening in the city. It's Brewing Agile, and one more thing, was it some EU or something? But this seems to be the safest place because I haven't seen any police officers around. And I think that's quite okay. I'm based in the finance organization of Statoil. I'll come back to the company. So I'm a finance guy, but some of you will know that I've also worked in HR, and I've also been in different leadership roles for more than 20 years. And I'm mentioning this because there's a big doses of people and leadership into Beyond Budgeting. As we often say, it is a kind of misleading name because this is not so much about budgets. This is actually business agility, which is a big thing these days. Scaling Agile has been a big thing for many years, and I've always argued that it's very hard to scale Agile up to the executive level, using exactly the same language, framework that works so well in software development. A lot of executives that don't play rugby, they would think that Scrum is some kind of skin disease, right? No offense, I'm a big fan of Scrum, but I mean, Beyond Budgeting offers a language that executives understand. They don't necessarily agree, but at least they understand what we are talking about. So this session is about business agility. When I joined Statoil many years ago, in the early 80s, it was a smaller company than what it is today. And most small organizations, they want to grow, they want to become bigger. And some succeed, but most of them succeeding realize that we have not only become big, we have also become slow, rigid, bureaucratic. We've lost a lot of that agility, flexibility we had as a smaller organization, right? And I find an interesting parallel here to the aging process of man, because as we get older, we do lose a bit of that agility we had as teenagers. And I'm starting to get some practical experience here. I know what I'm talking about. And when it comes to man, we have no choice, right? In the end, age takes us all. But organizations, they have a choice. It is written nowhere that because we are big, we should be slow, rigid, bureaucratic, and all the things that we don't want to be. So our journey at Statoil has very much been about trying to find our way back to that agility we had as a smaller organization without losing the benefits of being big. So our big question, how can we be big and small at the same time? The big question for small organizations should be, how can we grow without ending up in the same misery? All right, what I would like to share with you is first the bad news, the case for change, the fact that traditional management is in serious trouble. And I know that you know, but if this was a finance audience, this is something I need to spend quite a lot of time on to get them to understand that a lot of what they preach in practice is in big trouble. Then the good news is that there are ways out of this, and Beyond Budgeting is one of these ways. Again, a somewhat misleading name. The purpose is not necessarily to get rid of budgets. The purpose is to create these organizations that are more agile, more human. And in order to do that, we need to change traditional management. And what do we find at the core of traditional management? We find the budgeting process and the budgeting mindset. So that's where the name is coming from. But as you will learn, this is much bigger. Then I want to share with you how we are doing this stuff in Statoil. We started out in 2005, took some major decisions, kicking out the budget and a lot of other things. But I'm not going to stand here and share with you a sunshine story of everything being perfect. We still have issues. We have made mistakes. We have detours. We have stumbled. But that is what real change is about. Real change is never a kind of a nice line from A to B. Real change is actually quite messy. But I'm really proud of what we have been able to do, and we have some exciting stuff ongoing right now as well. Statoil, I'm going to be quick. This is the company. We are obviously into oil and gas, but renewable energy is becoming big for us. We are a strong believer in a low carbon future, so we are into offshore wind, because we are good at building big stuff at sea, and we are also moving into solar. We have a big project in Brazil right now. So no doubt, that is where the future is. Then I also want to share with you our leadership principles. newly updated. We have a new great CEO. And take a look at the one in the middle. It's empowerment. He is very clear about the need for pushing out authority, decision-making out in the front line, which is very much what Beyond Budgeting is about. Let me continue with a few quotes from some wise people that have inspired us. And I'd like to start with Dee Hock, the founder of Visa, the credit card company. Simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to complex, intelligent behavior. And the other way around. That could be one way of describing what Beyond Budgeting is about. You probably know this guy as well, Peter Drucker. Most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. And I would absolutely agree. That is one of the problems. We are sometimes, or very often, managing too much. Performance management, a label I don't like, right? If we don't manage performance, there will be no performance. I mean, that's bullshit. But it's not bad news because there are some great stuff we can do instead. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine, state-of-the-art, unique for the success of this company. Great stuff. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble, didn't work that well. And today, this machine is completely broken. It looks like this. And you are smart people, so you will understand that that's not a true story. In real life, this would never happen. 50 years ago, at least, wise people would have gotten together to do something about it, invented something better, right? Because we all love innovation. Innovation is great, fantastic, right? We want to be leading edge, unique, we want to be in the forefront, but that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology, product, and maybe services. But there is also something called management innovation, exploring new ways of leading and managing. Management innovation doesn't seem to be that great. That's scary. Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? A consequence of this is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side. All our competitors are heavily into technology and product innovation. Management innovation, on the other hand, is not yet a crowded place because it's scary. And that is good news for brave companies who dare to embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much performance and competitive advantage out of management innovation as you can from technology and product innovation. And there are organizations out there who say that we have no competitive advantage whatsoever in our technology, in our products, but we find it in the way we lead and manage. And I have a few examples for you in a minute. So we're going to talk a lot about this important word, performance. It's important that we define it the right way, but that's the only reason why we embarked on this journey in Statoil. 12 years ago, we believed this would be good for performance in the company. Today, we know that it's good for performance, defined in the right way. But before I talk more about performance, I want to just to get off my chest my budget problem list, because it is, after all, called Beyond Budgeting, so it has something to do with budgets. And I want just to kind of share with you why we think this process is so flawed. And I don't think you will be, again, difficult to convince. Again, if this was a finance audience, it's always harder to get these guys to understand it. It's quite a long list, very time-consuming. Right? At Statoil, we needed to start this process before the summer in order to get to finish. That's maybe why they call it the annual budget. Right? It takes all year. Assumptions quickly outdated. Exchange rate, oil price, market moves, competitors, who knows what will happen. This is a serious problem. It can stimulate unethical behaviors, lowballing, gaming, sandbagging, and all the stuff that we don't want to see. And by the way, the budget I'm talking about now is more the kind of annual, detailed, traditional budget. It's less about project budgets, even if project budgets have some of the same problems. But the budgets I'm talking about are creating even more problems. It can create illusions of control. And if we don't have control, it's better to acknowledge it and act accordingly than to think you have control and act accordingly. It can lead us to make decisions too early. We have to make all these decisions in the autumn the year before, right? Which is too big of a batch. We need more continuous delivery of our resources compared to all decisions in the autumn. And sometimes it leads to decisions being made too high up in organizations, which doesn't always improve decisions. Sometimes it's actually the other way around. It can prevent us from doing stuff we should have done, but we can't because it's not in the budget. And the other way around, it can actually lead people to do things they shouldn't do, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. Less money next year. You probably know the game. I don't know how big problem this is, but it's a bit funny. You know, when we finance people make budgets, we want to understand all of next year, 12 months ahead. Into next year, first quarter, suddenly 9 months is enough. We can still see till year end. Mid-year, 6 months is enough, then 3 months, before we suddenly get interested in 12 months again, because it's budget time. So you have this accordion forecasting horizon, which is at least a bit funny. This is a serious problem. To define good performance as hitting the budget numbers is a very narrow, mechanical, and sometimes a completely outdated language for describing good performance. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent language to define something that important. And most managers that I've met actually agree. A lot of finance people even agree that this is actually quite a flawed process. But maybe too many see these problems more as irritating itches and not as symptoms of a much serious problem. Because that is exactly what these problems are, symptoms of a very big and serious problem. And that's also a paradox, because this process was invented 100 years ago. It's actually quite old management technology. And in case you didn't know, the inventor was called James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. I never met the guy, but I don't think he was an evil guy. I think there was a best of intentions behind this at the time. This was management innovation 100 years ago, trying to help organizations to perform better. Maybe it worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago, but as we will come back to, no longer today. Today, this way of thinking, managing, is actually doing the opposite. It has become a barrier for organizations to perform to their full potential, and that is a big problem. So, performance. I would like to move on now by talking more about performance, but in a few minutes, we are going to leave our organizations and we're going to move into traffic. Because in traffic, we would also like to experience good performance. Driving to work in the morning or back home, and my definition of good performance in traffic would be a safe and good flow. I simply hate traffic jams. And by the way, I never understood why they call it the rush hour. There is no rush at all. Those cars are all standing dead still. But there's so much things I don't understand. Anyway, traffic authorities, they want the same, right? They want a safe and good flow. And here is something we often meet, put up by traffic authorities to create that safe and good flow. And by the way, this is the good old-fashioned traffic light. There's no sensors, no high tech, right? So, who is managing here and based on which information? Well, of course, the one who manages here is the guy who programmed this light. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting for the green light? Somewhere else. And which information would this programming be based on? Some historical trends, maybe some forecasts about how traffic could develop it, but it would not be entirely fresh information. So we have a management model here where decisions are made by somebody who is not in the situation and based on information that is not fresh. Do we have an alternative to the traffic light? Same purpose, very different solution. The roundabout. Good. Who is in control here? We are, as drivers. Based on which information? Based on fresh, real-time, here and now information. So very different answers to the same questions. So I think we should compare these two ways of managing a bit more. So let's do that. One of many leading questions today, which is most efficient? It has been proven that the roundabout is more efficient. Which is most difficult to drive in? Which takes most competence? The roundabout. And going back to our organizations for a minute, everything we are trying to leave behind in Statoil of traditional management is from a leadership point of view much easier than what we now are trying to do instead. But our guiding star cannot be to go for what's easy because it's easy. We have to go, and we should go, for the stuff that's good for performance, even if it is more difficult. Leadership is actually not meant to be easy. Last question, is it relevant to talk about values in this setting of traffic? In Statoil, we have something called the Statoil book. This is our most important document. It talks about who we are, what we believe in, how we work. Everything I will talk about later is in this book. And this book talks a lot about values-based management. And the opposite we could maybe call rules-based management. The traffic light is a good example of rules-based management. In case you've forgotten, red is stop, green is drive. We can always discuss yellow. But kind of beyond that, very simple rules-based system. And if there is a value set, a mindset among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest. That mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light, overruled by red. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, is actually a big problem. Because here we are much more dependent on having this positive, common purpose or wish of wanting this to flow well. We have to help each other. We have to make own intentions visible. We have to interpret other people's intentions. We have to interact with people in a very different way than what you need to do in front of that light. Two other words that are important here before we leave traffic. Trust. Ahead of that light, you could argue that traffic authorities actually don't trust us to make decisions. In the roundabout, they trust us. Transparency. Ahead of that light, the only thing you in theory need to see to make a decision, drive or not, is the color of the light, right? In the roundabout, you need to see everything. You need transparency in order to make a right decision. The label, I hinted on that I don't like the label performance management, but that label is highly relevant when it comes to the traffic light. That's exactly what traffic authorities are doing. They are managing performance. In the roundabout, I would argue that they are doing something else. That is more about enabling performance. It's about creating conditions for great performance to take place. And this is more than playing with words. This is two fundamentally different ways of thinking. And as I will come back to, I mean, our ability to manage performance in today's organizations is actually quite limited compared to what we like to think, whether we work in finance or HR or as executives. But it's not bad news because there's so much great stuff we can do when it comes to enabling performance. This book is a new version, does no longer include the word performance management. We talk a lot about performance. We talk about enabling performance and developing performance. But the performance management word is gone. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing compared to the traffic light. And self-regulation is another important word in our vocabulary. And going back to our organizations, I would argue that in today's business and people realities, organizations need more self-regulating management models for at least two reasons. The first reason has to do with our business environment. And in Statoil and other places, we talk a lot about what you probably have heard, VUCA, V-U-C-A, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. If we take that VUCA seriously, it should have implications, big implications, for how we design our management models, compared to if there was no VUCA out there. And when I joined Statoil and started my budget and planning career in the company in the early 80s, there was much less VUCA than what we have today. And just to mention it, my first management job in Statoil was head of the corporate budget department. So I've been heading up more budget processes in my life that I want to be reminded about in that job and in other finance manager jobs in different countries. So looking back, I've done an awful lot of stupid things in my life, at least on the professional side. But it means that it gives me a platform for being critical, because I've been there, I've done that, I know the game. And it's not very nice. So that is one reality we need to reflect on. The world out there, VUCA or, high VUCA, low VUCA. The other reality we need to reflect on is not external, it's internal. It has to do with people. It has to do with asking ourselves, what kind of people do we generally believe that we have in our organizations? And there are many labels and languages we can use for that discussion. We went back to good old Douglas McGregor, an American who wrote a great book back in 1960 called The Human Side of Enterprise. And he introduced what he called Theory X and Theory Y. Nothing to do with Generation X and Y, came much later. This is basically two opposing views on people and what motivates people. Where theory X is very much the negative view. That's the view that most people in an organization is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks, which all must be managed tightly and kept on short leashes, because if not, we know what will happen. Right? They will all run away, do a lot of stupid things, and spend money like drunken sailors. If you read the book, you will notice that McGregor was a bit more academic and polite in his book, but I think that's what he meant. Then you have theory Y, very much the opposite view, a much more positive view on people, a view that most people, beyond the fact that there is a lot of education and competence, that most people want to do a good job, want to perform, want to be involved, want to be listened to, want to be treated as adults. And we don't need so far to agree on where our sympathies are, although I think we agree. But it should be very easy to agree that if we mainly believe in Y, the implications for our management model should be very different compared to if we mainly believe in X. So we have these two realities we need to reflect on. The world out there, people in the organization, and if we combine this, it could look like this, and you recognize the two dimensions. And I would argue that traditional management here lies in that lower left-hand corner, with a conscious or unconscious assumption that the world is still a quiet and plannable place, and that most people is on the X side. If we disagree with those two assumptions, then we can't be in that lower left-hand corner. Then we need to move up in that upper right-hand corner. And the way to that corner goes through addressing both dimensions. Horizontally, we need to address leadership. Vertically, we need to address our management processes. And what we need to get out of traditional management is something I would argue is very rigid, very detailed, very annual, very rules-based, a lot of centralized command and control and micromanagement, a lot of secrecy, and a strong belief in sticks and carrots as ways to drive performance. Maybe there was a time when this was the right thing to do. Maybe there still are places around where this is the right thing to do. But for us in Statoil, that discussion is not very interesting. We know that our business environment is up there, and that goes way beyond all the uncertainty around energy prices. There's so much VUCA out there, and we believe that most people in Statoil is on the Y side, not on the X side. Not everybody. You know, every time I talk about X and Y, the same names and faces are popping up in my head, and the guys are in there right now. Those faces, names belongs to colleagues of mine at Statoil that I'm not saying there are thieves and crooks, but maybe we should keep an extra eye on them. And maybe there is a face or two popping up in your heads as well, because these guys we typically find in most organizations. But that is not the issue. The issue, do they represent a minority or a majority? Because if they exist but represent a minority, we cannot let minorities drive the design of our management models. Right? Then we need to start with our majority view. And if that is why, that must drive the design. And then we need to find other ways of dealing with these guys on the left-hand side. This is just like in a free society, right? We are all free citizens, right? So we don't put everybody in jail just because we have a few criminals among us. On the process side, what do we need to do? We need to address the traditional budget. The traditional budget typically has to go because it represents so much of what is down here. We need to think differently around how we set targets and goals. Right? I mean, in this VUCA world, we need less of what I often call 29.2 targets. It doesn't help that we hit 29.2 if the other guys are doing 30 and 35, or vice versa. We need to think a little bit more like in football, right? No football team would say that our most important goals for next year is to score 49 or 39 goals and get 42 points, and then it's champagne and hooray. They don't think like that. They think in terms of how are we doing. Those are budget goals, but they think in terms of kind of thinking relative, how are we doing versus peers. We need more dynamics into our processes, right? Why on earth should everything we do here circulate around the fiscal year of January to December? Right? That makes sense for looking backwards, accounting and some other stuff, taxes, but for this stuff we need to organize processes more on event-driven rhythms, business-driven rhythms, and less on calendar-driven rhythms. And last but not least, we need a holistic performance evaluation. Performance evaluation must be about something more than comparing two numbers and then conclude. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent language, and I will come back to what that means and how we do that in Statoil. And this, dear friends, was a crash course in Beyond Budgeting. This is actually what Beyond Budgeting is about. Addressing both leadership and management processes in a consistent, coherent way in order to become more agile, more human. Not necessarily as a goal in itself, but this is what it takes for organizations to compete in a positive sense in today's business and people environments. A number of organizations out there is today on this journey in some form or shape. And here's an overview of some of them. And I could have spent the rest of the day and tomorrow talking about fantastic management innovation taking place in many of these organizations. We don't have the time. So I'm going to give you a little taste from 2 companies here. Let's start in Norway. This is Miles, Norwegian IT company, business in Norway and in India. Miles have no budgets, no targets, no nothing. Just fantastic performance. Their most important process is recruitment. When they recruit, they never take less than 10 references. And when management interviews, the whole interview is about the candidate's beliefs, attitudes, values. They don't talk IT at all. They leave the testing of the IT skills to IT people already on board in Miles. They can test for the IT skills. And by the way, they have a veto right. Doesn't matter what, if they say no, it's a no. Doesn't matter what management is saying. It's an IT company, so obviously your equipment, your PC is important, and it's important to attend conferences and courses and whatever to maintain and develop your competence. If you work from Miles, you can buy whatever PC you want, as expensive as you want, replace it as often as you want. You can attend whatever conference, seminar, course you want as often as you want, wherever in the world. The only thing Miles require is that when you return from that conference, when you have bought that PC, you have to post on the intranet what you did and the cost of it. So transparency is their control mechanism. And by the way, if you think back to this one, that is transparency can actually be a very effective control mechanism. And there's a nice little story about a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Roche, quite traditionally managed, but they did a very interesting experiment around travel cost. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budget, most travel rules and regulations. What they introduced instead was full transparency. So with a few exceptions, everybody could see everything. If you travel, to where? Did you fly, sleep and eat, cheap or expensive? Guess what happened with travel cost in the pilot? Very simple self-regulating control mechanism. I'm not saying that you always need to go down on an individual level. We don't do that in Statoil. We don't have travel budgets. We have a lot of transparency. We stop at team level. And before I leave this one, I want to also say a few words about internal motivation. And you probably know, but a lot of finance people, and unfortunately a lot of HR people, seem not to know what 50 years of research is saying about internal or intrinsic motivation. But the research is pretty clear. It says that individual bonus as a way of motivating can be very effective if 3 conditions are in place. If there is little motivation in the job itself, if it's easy to count or measure, and if quantity is more important than quality. So for picking carrots, some simple sales work, maybe it works. But then research goes on and says that for more complex work, as you probably know, then it's mastery, purpose, autonomy, and belonging that's up there as the most powerful things, and money is way down the list. I wish more executives hadn't stopped reading after they graduated, but because maybe that is the problem, because this is so well known out there. Anyway, back to my list of organizations. So that's Miles, fantastic performance. And their big issue is how can we grow without ending up in the same misery as other organizations. But the veteran here is Swedish Handelsbanken. And you know, we had a workshop yesterday, and I was actually a bit surprised that a lot of people had more knowledge about Morningstar from the US than Handelsbanken from Sweden. But the short version is that Handelsbanken is kind of pioneer here. Kicked out the budget and a lot of other things already back in 1970 in order to become more decentralized, call it more agile, more human. Maybe they didn't use that word at the time, but that was the purpose. And the interesting with the bank that has no budgets, do not set targets, hardly make forecasts, is the fantastic performance. The bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every year since 1972. It's the most cost-effective universal bank in Europe, 800 branches across Europe, the fastest growing bank in the UK right now, the most cost-effective universal bank. And the bank has never needed a bailout from the authorities because they messed it up. I can think of a number of other banks who at some point in time needed help because they messed it up. Handelsbanken never. It can't be a coincidence, right? Radically different management model and fantastic results over such a long time. I don't have time to go into the details, but the essence of it is very much, I talked about league tables. I'm thinking football. Well, that's what they do. They have a few simple KPIs and they compare, or branches can at any time see how they are doing versus others. For the branches kind of performing less well than others, there are no instructions from above that you need to cut cost or do this or do that. The only message from above is that we note that you have a problem, but it's your problem. And you also know best what the right medicine is to solve this issue, because you are closest to your customers, to your teams, to the market. And your medicine cupboard is big enough to do what you need to do. Right? So a lot of decentralization, a lot of autonomy, a lot of transparency. No targets coming from above, that now you need to kind of climb 2 places. The team itself might set themselves a target of we want to climb, but there's a big difference between targets coming from above versus targets that you set for yourself. But that's just half the story, because they also want to use these league tables, this benchmarking, for the original purpose of benchmarking, which was learning, right? They want the guys down here to call the guys up here and ask, what are you doing on this and this performance issue that obviously we are not that good at? Can we have a talk? But they are not saints in Handelsbanken. They are humans like you and me. And if you're up here, why should you help somebody down here that one day might threaten your number 1 spot? It is nicer to be up here than down here. What the bank has done in order to make sure that transfer of learning is taking place is to say no individual bonus. All bonus is common, driven by how well is Handelsbanken doing versus other banks. That gives everybody an incentive to pick up their phone and help others. Amazing management model. By the way, the common bonus scheme, it's the same amount for everybody. So the one that has the lowest percentage bonus in Handelsbanken is the guy at the top. And it might sound strange, but maybe not at all, because if it should be so that bonus is necessary to motivate, why do the guy at the top need the biggest doses of that motivation medicine? I thought that was you find some of the most interesting jobs in companies, but as I said, there's a lot of things I don't understand. Anyway, Handelsbanken and some other companies here inspired what became known as beyond budgeting in the late 90s. And I want to share with you those principles on the next slide. But you will probably know that the Agile Manifesto also came about roughly at the same time. And there are some interesting parallels between the two concepts. Take the one about responding to change instead of following a plan. Well, that could be picked out of the beyond budgeting principles. Continuous delivery, as I will come back to, is another example. The principles look like this, and we don't have time to go into details here. But you will see that we need to address both leadership and management processes. On the leadership side, I have talked about some of these things: purpose, values, transparency, autonomy. And I'll come back to some of these management processes when we move to Statoil. But this is recommendations on all the things that executives from a management point of view need to think about in an organization. What's the rhythm in your management processes? How do you set targets? How do you plan a forecast? How do you allocate resources? How do you evaluate performance? And how do you reward performance? So this is very much a big comprehensive management model addressing both leadership and management. A few important messages. These are principles. They provide guiding, inspiration, But what this should mean in an organization, that depends on that organization's business, culture, history. This is not a management recipe, right? I don't like management recipes. There are enough of them out there. Because in a management recipe, the only thing you need to do is to read the books, hire the consultants, tick the boxes, implement other people's thinking. Implementing beyond budgeting, you have to think for yourself. What should this mean for us? So if you look at those organizations on the previous slide, it's not the same that has happened in these organizations. And some are very early on the journey, some are way ahead of Statoil, but they are all doing something. When we started out in Statoil 2005, we were actually a bit careful showing this slide too widely for a very simple reason. Some people think this is big and scary stuff, especially finance people, but also some managers. And if you scare people, you risk not getting started. So we started out in a less scary place, asking ourselves a very simple question: why do we budget? And we had that exercise in the workshop yesterday, and the three purposes that we arrived on was that we make budgets in order to set targets, financial targets, sales target, production targets. We make budgets in order to have a view of what next year could look like in terms of cash flow, financial capacity. And we make budgets to have a resource allocation mechanism, right? It's about handing out bags of money to the organization, so much for you and so much for you. Three different purposes might sound very effective, just like a financial Kinder egg, but that's also the problem. What happens if we ask salespeople for a good sales forecast, but everybody knows that the number I now send upstairs will come back to me as a sales target, and there's a sales bonus linked to that? Or what happens if we ask people for a good cost forecast, and everybody knows that, well, last year they cut my number with 30%. Well, that will have an impact on the numbers sent upstairs. Those numbers will go that way. The first numbers about sales will typically go that way. This is a problem. It introduces, stimulates gaming, lowballing, and all the things that we don't want. Fortunately, a very simple solution. At Statoil, we still do all these three things, but in three separate processes, because these are different things. A target is what we want to happen. A forecast is what we think will happen, what we like, what we see. Brutally honest, expected outcome. And resource allocation is about optimizing scarce resources. And this can become different numbers. And once we have separated, that opens up a huge improvement agenda. Then we can have great discussions about how we can do each of these three things in different and better ways. Discussions that we couldn't have had when it was all bundled in this financial Kinder egg. Like, for instance, how can we have targets that really inspire and stretch without people feeling stretched, and that are more VUCA-robust? And in some organizations, the discussions move further into, do we need all these targets? Can we actually do without targets? Miles, Handelsbanken, they don't have targets. And this is where we are at Statoil now. We have spent many years setting better targets. Now we are into the discussion about, can we get rid of a lot of these targets? How can we have a lean, simple, unbiased forecasting process where we know we can trust the numbers, because these numbers are now just a forecast. They are no longer a bid into a target negotiation. They are no longer an application for resources, because that we do in other ways. And resource allocation, how can that be optimized? These are some headlines of how we do things in Statoil. I don't have time to go in depth, but very quickly, the short version of how we manage costs. Projects, and for us, projects is building big stuff at sea. Billions of dollars, big. Very simple principle, the bank is always open. You can always forward a project for approval. There's no annual pre-allocated investment budget. But yes or no depends on two things: how good is your project against the criteria we have and against other projects. And second question, can we afford it as things look today? Very simple, dynamic resource allocation, continuous delivery of resources. This is about trying to make decisions at the right time, which is as late as possible, because then we have better information, not just about the project, but also about our capacity, and at the right level, not all decisions upstairs. For other costs, operating costs, administrative costs, we have a menu of different alternatives. It could be an overall guiding, operate at a cost level that is roughly in the area of 10 million, 20 million, until something else is decided. No details within that. Could be a unit cost target. You can spend more if you produce more, if you sell more. Could be a benchmark unit cost target. Or it could be nothing at all. Only looking at actual numbers, monitoring actual cost, and seeing that things are kind of okay. And if things looked a bit strange, we take a look at it, and there might be perfectly good reasons for why it should look like this. But we might also come across managers who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. Because the only thing you know in an organization if you show trust is that someone will abuse that trust. At Statoil, it has happened, it will happen again. The easy thing to do, which is the wrong thing to do, is to put everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. The right thing to do is to deal firmly with that situation and let it have the necessary consequences, but don't punish everybody else. And finally, how can all of this be done more event-driven, less calendar-driven? And as I recommended to the workshop participants yesterday, I mean, if you want to convince your finance or make your finance guy interested, this is a nice slide. Because with this one, we can tell finance people that if they think that kicking out the budget is unthinkable, we can tell them that, well, we still do what the budget tried to do for us. But by separating, we can do each of those three things in much better ways. How scary is that? So, we will go to ambition to action, which is our process where all of this is coming together, right? It's a kind of hybrid between the balanced scorecard and beyond budgeting. Three purposes: translating strategy, securing autonomy, flexibility, and last but not least, activate important words in this book about people, values, and leadership. There are some steps in this process that might not look very unique as they appear here, but the way we do this is quite different from a lot of organizations, and I want to share that with you towards the end here. We translate strategy into strategic objectives. What does success look like on a medium-term time horizon, more on words than on numbers? Then we address risk into this. What are the risks related to achieving those or not achieving those objectives, or other risks in our operations? Then we are identifying actions that can either take us towards those objectives or address risk, or do both. This is actually quite something new in business management. A lot of organizations are good on risk management, they are good on business management, but it's very separate. We are merging it together. Then we are trying to find indicators that can measure that we are moving towards these objectives. The only small problem with measurement is that measurement alone moves nothing. Nothing happens just because we measure. You don't lose weight simply by weighing yourself. And I know, because I've tried. And it didn't work that well, because nothing happens unless we do something. That's why it's called ambition to action, right? And last but not least, the translation over to what does this mean for you and me and the teams we are in? And here is an example of activating important words in this book. The very first words in the starter book: the way we deliver is as important as what we deliver. And with the way we deliver, we talk about the values in this book. And the two, the what and the how, count in all consequences for your career, for your base pay. If you should be on a bonus scheme, would count 50-50. Here's an example of an ambition to action. And I won't go into detail here, but you recognize this is the old version, by the way. Before we are integrating risk right now, so risk will come in as a new column. And you will note that in order to create value down here, these are the things we need to be good at. So this is very non-financial. There is actually, most of this stuff is addressing non-financial things that we need to be good on in order to create value. We have around 800 of these in the organization today, and I would like to use this slide towards the end. It's a bit hard to see the top here, but I hope you can make it. I'd like to use this slide to illustrate two other areas where we try to be different. The first has to do with alignment. How do you get that red strategic thread throughout this? There is an easy way, which is the wrong way, called cascading. Sitting at corporate level, instructing from above, all the way down. These are your objectives, KPIs, KPI targets. It's very easy from a corporate perspective, but it doesn't help if that destroys all the involvement, commitment, and ownership out here. If these ambition to actions only becomes a landing box for instructions from above, well, that alignment isn't worth very much, because all the commitment and the involvement has walked out the door. So what we do instead is something we call translation, which means that if you're a team here, and you and your team shall make your own ambition to action, you would look around, upstairs, one level up, further up, maybe all the way to corporate, maybe left and right, if you have relations this way. And then you and your team should have a deep, good discussion about how should our ambition to action look like to support those around us that we have a relationship to, when it comes to direction, when it comes to ambition level. If that translation should go wrong, of course the team above should do what they are paid for, but it's not the problem, and it's probably because of transparency, because all of these ambition to actions are open, accessible for all employees. There is some share sensitive information we have to hide, but beyond that, everything open. So there shouldn't be a place to hide with stupid ambition to action. Transparency also has a learning perspective. We want people to learn and be inspired from each other. The second area where we try to be different has to do with time. We used to have annual versions of ambition to action. Not anymore. Today, these teams can change whatever they want on their own ambition to action when there is a need for it. They can change strategic objectives. If strategy change, they can change KPIs if they find better KPIs. And they can change KPI targets if these targets have lost their meaning. Lost their meaning, I mean, impossible to achieve or piece of cake. But this is not an anarchy. We have a very simple control mechanism. If you are here and want to change something that's big, you can do it at any time, but you still need to seek approval one level up. That's not a stamp or a signature. You have to talk to someone. If you change it small, you just inform to the same level. Big or small, make sure that you inform others affected by your changes. And we have left it to the organization itself to define what's big and small, so they might have a different definition over here than over here. But as long as it works both places, that's okay. Back to the self-regulation, right? We would like this to run as much as possible by itself without us having to do much at corporate level. The less we need to intervene, the better. We shouldn't abdicate. We shall support when needed, of course intervene when needed. But this is meant to be these teams' way of helping themselves to manage themselves, more than the corporate control system. Targets, to the extent you should have targets. Why should they all have a deadline of end of December? Doesn't make sense. We want to have more natural time horizons. If there's urgency, put 3 months. If it's more complex, put 18 months. So, as I'm standing here, somebody in Statoil is updating something on their own ambition to action because stuff has happened in their own business reality. Right? We have access to all this information from corporate, so we can tap into it for the needs we have. So, a dynamic ambition to action. Let me now finish off with what we call a dynamic performance evaluation. And this is what we mean with that expression. Dynamic actually means two things. First of all, the 50-50 between the what and the how. But holistic evaluation here also means that when we shall evaluate what we have delivered, which is defined by ambition to action directly and indirectly, that cannot be reduced to an exercise of adding up the number of red and green KPIs. Because if we are dumbing down an important exercise to something like that, the only qualification our managers would need is that they must be able to count, and they can't be colorblind. And we should have somewhat higher requirements. So we might start with counting, but then we take off the measurement classes and look at what measurement didn't pick up. We pressure test using some simple questions. And the reason for that has to do with the I in KPI. What does that stand for? Key performance indicators. These are indicating something, but they are not necessarily telling the full truth. Generally, they are not telling the full truth. There is a reason they are called KP. They are not called KPTs, key performance truth. They are called key performance indicators. We can't base our entire management and evaluation on indicators. So we pressure test by asking these simple questions. I see your KPI is green, but have we really moved towards these objectives? How ambitious were your targets? Has there been changes in assumption, headwind, tailwind, of such a nature that we should take it into account? How well did you handle risk? And what you have delivered, is it sustainable? And until 2 weeks ago, that would result in a rating on a 1 to 5 scale, both dimensions, that is gone. We decided 2 weeks ago to kick our performance rating, and I'm very happy. I never liked it, and now it's gone. We will still be able to use conclusions here for development plans for all employees and for rewards, base pay adjustments, or it could be individual bonus. We have some limited schemes, which I don't like very much, but the most important thing is this holistic evaluation. Okay, I'm going to flip through a bit more here, see if we can find the final slides. We talked about a lot of stuff yesterday. Yeah. Have you ever seen such a fast presentation? Huh? Did you get it? So this is what I wanted to share with you. If you want to contact me later on, these are my coordinates. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, please. I only tweet about this stuff. As I said yesterday, there are no cats and dog or family or nothing. And if you're even more interested, check out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable, bbrt.org. And maybe you want to check out our Swedish partner, which is actually from Gothenburg. They are called Ekan Management Consulting. They actually have their office just down the street here. Great guys. And if you're even more interested, this is the long version. You just heard a short version. I wrote the book 7-8 years ago, which I've just finished an extended update of. So this is the second edition, more about everything, and also a new chapter about Beyond Budgeting and Agile. It's an easy read. I've been trying to write the book that I wanted to read myself. So that's it. Thank you very much.